to Wellbeing Wednesdays, brought to you by the Tulane University Counseling Center. I'm one of your co-hosts, Shawna Foose. I'm a therapist at the center, and I'm joined as always by my lovely co-host.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jinaki Flint, staff psychologist here at the Counseling Center, and we are joined today by Dr. Shaciarra Hamilton, who has some wonderful things to share with us today. Welcome, Dr. Hamilton.
Thank you. And Shakar's fine. No doctor
yet.
Okay. Almost there.
Yes, almost.
Yeah. So
we're
today
we're really excited to have you. So let's have you go ahead and share your screen and let's get going.
Cool. Yes. Thank you. So share screen. All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep. It looks good.
Beautiful. Okay. So today I'll be talking with you guys a little bit about racial battle fatigue, and I'll just hop right in if that's okay with y'all.
Absolutely.
All right. So this is the outline that has structured my presentation. Even though the focus of this presentation is racial battle fatigue, to understand racial battle fatigue and how we get there, it's important to have a little background about the types of diversity-related trauma and microaggressions that lead to racial battle fatigue, and then also wanted to talk about a little bit of how people typically cope with racial battle fatigue. All right, so to start us off, let's talk a little bit about diversity-related traumas. And I'm not going to go over all of these, but I do want to put them there if people want to do further research on their own, and I'll just go over some of the ones that aren't as commonly known about. So you have direct physical and emotional verbal, vicarious trauma, pervasive white supremacy, and the devaluation of cultural principles. And the devaluation of cultural principles is anything that is not white culture is considered other or less than or inferior. You got subjugation, exclusion, oppression, people being ostracized. Denial of racism is exactly what it sounds like, saying racism doesn't exist, or we're so much more past that. Aversive racism is a little bit more complex and a little bit more complicated than the overt racism that people tend to know about. Aversive racism is more of ambivalence towards racial and ethnic minority groups, and it also can tend to have some avoidance of those racial and ethnic minority people. And even though people may feel ambivalent towards these groups, the ideas and the attitudes and the expressions that they have about them is often very laden with prejudiced ideals. And a good example would be, if you are interacting with a racial and ethnic minority and the way that you're interacting with that person has changed because of their membership in that group, that's probably a sign that you are maybe experiencing and executing some aversive racism. Stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is being at risk of confirming negative stereotypes about your group based on your own personal characteristic. So in 1995, just some background about that, 1995, Steele and Aronson did a study about this with Black and white children and standardized testing. So they gave both groups of children a standardized test and emphasized race, right? Think about your race, think about how your race does on these tests. And they got the results back. And then they did it again and gave them the same standardized test, but did not emphasize race this go around, got the results back. What they found was that the Black children, when they emphasized race, performed poorly, right? But then when they didn't emphasize race for those Black children, they performed equally or better to their white counterparts. So that would be what stereotype threat is. A more common example would be women in math. Like, I'm a woman, women are typically bad at math, or so that's what the society says. So when you get a math test, you don't do as well because you're thinking about, if I do bad, I'm confirming the stereotype that women are bad at math. Imposter phenomenon. Oh, this is when people cannot internalize and accept that their success is because of their ability and their hard work and their natural talents. They very often attribute their accomplishments to luck or to other people or to just, oh, well, it just kind of happened, coincidence. And they have this fear that other people will discover that they're frauds or imposters. That's where the term imposter phenomenon comes out from. Institutionalized racism is just that racism that is interwoven into the fabric of our country and the institutions that are erected in this country. Pressure to remain voiceless or silent is a large one. Very often when people of color or BIPOC people express, this is what happened to me, this is an injustice, or I was wronged, they're very often dismissed or ignored or invalidated. And it can also come with a cost. You can lose your job, your safety can be compromised. So there's this pressure to remain silent instead of quote unquote rocking the boat. You can be treated as a threat to physical safety or people's jobs or white culture just by your mere presence or anything related to your culture. Otherized. So we have this assumption that white, cisgender male, and normal-bodied people are the default. So anything outside of that means you're other. Cultural appropriation. That has been a huge buzzword in 2020. And so I'm sure people have a pretty solid idea about it, but I'll give a brief summary of it. So it's using objects or elements about a non-dominant culture in a way that doesn't respect or represent the original meaning and use of that element, and it doesn't give credit to the source. It perpetuates stereotypes, contributes to oppression, and honestly, you know, it's really offensive to people, and it steals a part of their culture away from them that doesn't give them power and is really offensive. Legal racism would be like racial profiling, mass incarceration, over-policing communities of color, criminalizing immigration, healthcare disparities, and other unequal access. That is something that has been highlighted as well during the COVID pandemic. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. This one may not be as widely known, so I'll spend a few more minutes going over that. So in about 2005, Dr. Joy DeGruy, after many years of getting quantitative and qualitative data about this, created this term to describe the multi-generational trauma and injustices that are experienced by African American or Black people in this country. And it stems from the dawn of enslavement when African people were brought to this country and then forced to be enslaved, to the recent and continuous deaths of Black citizens at the hands of white police officers in general, other white citizens. And what Dr. DeGruy was saying, that this syndrome can lead to PTSD-like symptoms, avoidance, nightmares, vigilance, and it can lead to changes in self-evaluation, so how you feel about yourself, how you think about yourself, and your behaviors. I think it's very important to realize that and to mention that Dr. DeGruy was not saying this to pathologize people. She was saying this to give people context about these things that have been happening. Generational trauma has been happening to African American and Black people since the dawn of enslavement. And if we think about how trauma affects people and epigenetics, it is something that has changed the fiber of being African American or Black in this country. And I say PTSD-like symptoms because I'm very mindful that it's not intended to pathologize people. PTSD is in the DSM. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is not something you can give an individual therapy for. It's not something you can take a medication for. It's something that's going to require some social justice change and changing the way that we move throughout society as a whole. And then intercultural prejudice would be colorism, body image ideals, and diversity-related trauma around sexual and gender identity, and internalized racism. Internalized racism is when you internalize and believe those attitudes about the hierarchical system of white people being superior to BIPOC people. And for those that are not familiar with the term BIPOC, it stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. I just use that as a general term, but in case you're not familiar with it, that's what it means. Did you ladies want to jump in on anything before I go to the next slide?
No, you've done a great job. I certainly don't. I would put the QT in front of the BIPOC and keep it pushing. So we cover everyone.
Yes. All right, I'm gonna go to the next one. And you know what, before we move on, I want to draw attention to this picture that I put here on the left because I did it very purposefully. This is a picture of a death by 1,000 arrows. When I explain this trauma and the effect of trauma, it would be like getting sliced with one kind of arrow. Any one of these traumas would be like one arrow. Unfortunately, very often, QT and BIPOC people have numerous experiences of numerous of these types of trauma on a daily basis. So you can be struggling with stereotype threat, imposter phenomenon, institutionalized racism, vicarious trauma, all at once, every single day. And this is not at all an exhaustive list, but just imagine how having all of those things come at you all the time can impact you and your well-being.
A powerful image.
Yes, I thought so too. Thank you.
Great, excellent metaphor
Thank
or
you.
analogy.
Next, we're going to chat a little bit about microaggressions. And I put micro in quotations because it's a little bit of a misnomer. When you say microaggression, it doesn't capture the immense and significant impact that these acts can have on people. You think about the weight of words. You say words have power, and then you think about microaggressions as something that's small and subtle and doesn't have that big of an impact. So microaggressions is a little bit of a misnomer, but that's the word, so we'll roll with it. But they're defined as a statement or an action or an incident that is indirect and subtle or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. And I broke this down into a few subcategories that went from, I would say, more obvious to less obvious, or more intentional to less intentional as well. So microassaults are attitudes and beliefs of people who are consciously aware that they're being biased. So they are intending to hurt people when they do these things. The next one would be micro insults. These are a little bit harder to detect, but they are rude and demeaning communications. And the people that do these micro insults may not be consciously aware of the insult, but that doesn't mean the insult doesn't still hurt and doesn't still cause trauma. And sometimes it is embedded in what people believe is a compliment. An example would be, oh my gosh, you're so well spoken, or you're so pretty for a Black girl, or wow, who taught you how to do that? And so while that may be intended as a compliment, it is offensive and hurtful. Some examples of that would be exoticizing, being chosen to be a part of a group on the assumption that you can do something because of your membership in a racial or ethnic minority group. Or being an entertainer, people perceiving you as an athlete or an entertainer because you're a member of a QT or a BIPOC population. Being seen as a deviant or someone that's untrustworthy or criminal. A day-to-day example of that would be grabbing your purse when you see someone of color or crossing the street. And it's not based on if you have these experiences that have led you to do that, but simply because this person is a part of the QT or BIPOC population that you do these things. That is a microaggression. Symbolic micro insults is photogenic representations of white people that embody all these positive characteristics and BIPOC people embodying negative characteristics. A good exercise for this is go to Google and type in white people and see what comes up. When I have done this exercise with people, it has come up with these beautiful LinkedIn headshots, beautiful families frolicking in the park, beautiful bright light backgrounds, people frolicking with their pets, and they all look very beautiful. And then when you type in Black people, you get mugshots and things associated with violence and dirtiness and redlining, and the vibe is very different and the messages are very clearly differently expressed. So if you have a minute, give it a shot, see what happens. Maybe it has changed in the last 2 weeks, but let me know what you come up with. And then last thing we'll talk about on this slide is micro invalidations. They arise from this need to obviate differences, right? Saying, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. While that may mean that you're trying to say that I see us all as equal and we're all people, it negates the impact that our differences do have on us, right? And it negates the reality that is experienced by marginalized people. The fact of the matter is my identification as a racial ethnic minority does impact how I experience life and how people interact with it. And so that is a micro invalidation to be mindful of. All right, now the bread and butter of our conversation today is racial battle fatigue. So Dr. Smith, and I think he was at the University of Illinois, as a matter of fact, when he did this, and he's currently at the University of Utah. He defined racial battle fatigue as the cumulative result of a natural race-related stress response to distressing mental and emotional conditions. And these conditions emerge from constantly facing racially dismissive, demeaning, insensitive, or hostile racial environments and individuals. And originally, Dr. Smith created this to talk about the African-American man's experience. However, it has been expanded to include all BIPOC people. And one of the biggest things whenever I talk about racial trauma with people is that I hear is, oh, we're so far past racism. No one's burning crosses anymore. No one's openly discriminating against people. We all can go to the same restaurants, and we all have freedom, and we all can do the same things that we want to do. And I found a beautiful quote from Dr. Smith that said, racial battle fatigue stems from racism and microaggressions. In order to view these acts in today's societies, you have to not look at the gross and obvious acts of discrimination. So telling people they can't drink from the same water fountain as you, or telling people they can't go sit by you. But the subtle and cumulative many assaults is a substance of today's racism. So when people say, oh, we're so much past racism, I think they think of the gross and obvious acts of racism. However, they're failing to see what the experiences of people is on a daily basis are those microaggressions that we just talked about on the previous slide. Those are harder to see, but without recognizing and acknowledging those, you miss at least 80% of the racism that is still alive today and what people experience on a very regular basis. All right, so let's talk about the impact of racial battle fatigue. Almost any aspect of functioning that you can think about, racial battle fatigue impacts for BIPOC people. This list is not exhaustive by any means. I just wanted to give you guys a snapshot of some of the higher functioning levels that I could think of. So physically you can feel physically fatigued, you have suppressed immunity, headaches, chronic pain and heel injuries, elevated blood pressure, upset stomach, etc. And I want to circle back to vigilance. I skipped over that originally because I want to talk a little bit about it. I very purposely put vigilance and not hypervigilance, because the word hypervigilance kind of suggests that the vigilance is disproportionate to the situation or the environment or what the person is experiencing. And when microaggressions and racial trauma can impact your safety, not just discomfort, it goes to a place of safety. It is very much so an appropriate thing to be mindful of. And historically, it has been shown that this racial trauma does impact your safety. And so I want people to be mindful to maybe think about how you frame things like hypervigilance versus vigilance in context, okay? Mentally, racial battle fatigue can cause anxiety, depression, stress, insomnia, nightmares, avoidance, decreased self-esteem and self-confidence. Emotionally can cause you to be fearful or have this sadness or anger. You feel helpless, numb, irritable. You may have some mood swings. Socially, you could withdraw from your friend group. You can have some isolation, which is probably compounded upon during COVID, disconnection, loss of relationships. And these are not all the categories that this can hit upon, but these are some of the more commonly known ones. And I think those are important to think about. Just thinking about losing the health in all of these areas on top of having to thrive in these institutionalized institutions that are, the fabric is interwoven with racism and also trying to maintain this level of greatness, the impact is astronomical. All right, so now that we talked about the impact of racial battle fatigue, let's talk a little bit about how people typically cope with racial battle fatigue. So some common coping mechanisms from the literature are something called John Henryism, perseverance and resilience, and dismissing or ignoring the problem. If you don't know the story about Mr. John Henry, I'll give you a snippet. So there is some back and forth about whether Mr. John Henry was an actual person or if it's just folklore. And historians in Virginia have confirmed that Mr. John Henry was an actual person. The story around him is based on his experience and it hasn't been embellished upon. However, Mr. Henry was a real person. And the story goes that in about the 1800s, maybe 1866, give or take, Mr. Henry was a 19-year-old African-American man. He got convicted of theft in Virginia courts and was sentenced to 10 years to life in the penitentiary. And while he was in the penitentiary, he went and started working on the railroad there. And the folklore goes that Mr. Henry was one of the best workers they had ever seen, but they created this machine that was supposed to do the work of 10 men in the time it took for one to do the same work. And in the story, since this was Mr. Henry's job, not something he wasn't in the penitentiary doing this for less money, this was something he did for the livelihood of his family, he felt his livelihood was threatened. And so he bet that he could do more, nail more, what are they called? Hooks?
Yeah.
Yes, he could put more of those into the rocks than the machine could in an hour. And so they had a race. So Mr. Henry, against all odds, put more hooks into the ground than the machine did. And everyone praised him and he was a local hero. However, he died from that stress and that physical exertion that he has. And people were still celebrating him and saying how he beat all odds, but they downplayed that he paid the ultimate price for it. And so John Henry Islam was born to describe high effort overachieving perfectionism in these environments that are where you're thriving despite inequality, financial hardship, racial discrimination, and all other racial traumas. And so it's basically you're working twice as hard to prove your worth despite all the barriers in your way. Then the grit, perseverance, and resilience coping mechanism is when people basically say, I'm going to bear this and I'm still going to be amazing and I'm going to do great things. And it's similar to John Henryism, but it's a little bit different. And I find it interesting about resilience because resilience was originally a scientific word and it came from the Latin word to jump. And then Francis Bacon, who was an experimenter, took that word and used it for something else. And he says that, so Francis Bacon says that resilience of a material is its ability to return to its original shape after being compressed or stretched or changed, right, or put under severe pressure. And now we apply that to people in an interesting way. And people we don't go back to the original when things happen to us. We do change. We are flesh and blood. We are not just material that can go back to the original shape. And then dismissing or ignoring the problem is also another coping mechanism. And while these are very understandable and they have shown to have benefit, they also can come at a great cost, right? They can further perpetuate feelings of distress and have long-term negative effects. When people are faced with adversity, especially against things like inequality or financial hardship and racial discrimination, those high effort coping mechanisms that are required to thrive will damage your health through stress. And there have been direct biological effects that have been observed when your body undergoes extreme stress, especially on a continuous basis. The research has shown that your body, when under extreme stress, will activate, right, to go into the flight, or freeze situation. And when you're experiencing something anxiety-provoking over and over, your body produces more adrenaline, your heart races, and your body's like, all right, I'm ready to react. I'm ready to keep us safe. So someone who has experienced trauma over and over may have stronger surges of adrenaline, may be more easily triggered into those anxiety states, and they may have more wear and tear on the body. It would be like if you revved up a car and you took off racing every single day and you expected the engine to be just as good as when you first drove it off the lot. Stress responses have that kind of effect on the body. It ages you faster. So here are some other coping options that people can consider. And this is not an exhaustive list, it's just some things that I thought would be helpful. So mindful isolation, and you have to do this in as plausible situation as you can. BIPOC people have the right to leave triggering situations, and that's not always an option, but if it is, consider what you're spending your time doing, who you're spending it with. If you find yourself always activated in that situation or with those people, maybe we need to get some distance from those people. Asking for help or connecting in community. Dr. Edwin Nichols did a beautiful study that took him so many years, but it's called The Physiological Aspects of Cultural Differences. And it talks a lot about axologies. Axology is like the study of nature, of validation, and things that we value. And he talks about how many BIPOC communities historically have value member-to-member formats. So relationships between people are the most important in those cultures, and they feed those people's souls and offer them help and support in tough times. And if you have time, definitely look that up. And I've learned so much about that. And I'm saying all that to say that connect to your community, connect to your people. It does not mean that you're weak. It means that you are, first off, touching into your ancestral coping mechanisms, and you're benefiting from the beautiful things that your people have to offer. Engaging in social justice causes. I say do this when you can, right after you've taken care of yourself. Taking your pain and going to do some social justice things helps you feel productive, helps you feel like you experienced what you did for a purpose, and helps you feel like you're serving other people like you. But you also need to take care of yourself, okay? And social justice can look so many different ways. It doesn't have to be marching on the streets, but if you can and you want to do that safely, go for it. It can take so many different shapes and forms, and it's important to realize that if it's giving money, if it's educating someone, if it's doing your own work and educating yourself so that you are a part of the solution, those are all social justice things you can do.
Personal justice must come first.
It must, yes. And then the last one I'll hit on this slide is attend to your whole essence. When we talked about the impacts of racial battle fatigue, I hit on some of the areas that racial battle fatigue can impact, but the research has shown that it does impact all the aspects of your being, from your spiritual to your physical. And so if you can do some self-care things that make you feel better physically, that's wonderful. Do some things that feed your spirituality, that's also great. You need to take a holistic view to caring for yourself. And these quotes here are two of some of the most awesome quotes that I love. They're two of my favorite quotes, and I feel like they're very relevant to the topic at hand. So the first one says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And that's by Audre Lorde. I know very often we find, oh, I don't want to be selfish. I have so much work to do. There's so many people that need me. However, it's not self-indulgence to take caring for yourself. Like Dr. Flint said, you have to care for yourself first before you can serve others. And the next one is from Judith Herman. She says, the ordinary response to atrocity is to banish them from our consciousness. Remembering and telling the truth about terrible events are prerequisites both for the restoration of the social order and for healing the individual victims.
Mm-hmm.
Without...
Ashe.
You can't heal from something that you don't address from. And also, the healing of this racial trauma is not solely on the backs of the victimized. It is on us as an entire society to make social change. And we can't do that by saying, oh, we're just going to move past that without addressing it. And that's also really dismissive of the experience that marginalized people are experiencing. And so we've talked a lot about what BIPOC folks can do if they have racial battle fatigue. And so what you're thinking, maybe, what if I'm not a person of color? What can I do to help my friends and family, or even other people in my life that I feel are struggling with this? One of the things you can do is affirm and acknowledge. And acknowledging that this is a real thing and what's going on can be stressful is very, very important. And putting a name to it and showing that you understand and that you don't ascribe that responsibility to the individual can make a mountain of difference. Understand what role you might play here. Your actions or lack thereof, your social media posts, your comments, your behaviors, those could be contributing to the fatigue of someone else. A great example would be the microaggressions. Maybe you've done those and you didn't mean ill intent, however, that is what happened. Give people space and let them know that you care. So depending on your relationship, check in with people to see how they're doing. You want to give them space, but also let them know that you're there. So tell them that you want to support them in the best way you can, but also give them space to process and come to you for help in a way that they deem appropriate and that they seem when they're ready for. And become more aware. Do some research, do some reading about the historical issues that BIPOC and QT people have faced and continue to face. Understanding that context will help you to be more understanding, help you sympathize with people as they go through this journey and they fight these daily battles. And that is it from me, ladies. Here's my references.
Thank you so much, Shaciarra. That was incredible, and definitely some really great tips on coping. You introduced this concept. It's not a new concept, but thank you for sharing that information and educating us and creating an awareness about it and discussing how it impacts us from a mental health and a mental wellness standpoint, giving us some tips on coping and management of our own states of mood states and states of being around it, and also the added package of how can people support, was really brilliantly done. Thank you so much. I'm honored to see you today. I love the part that something that you said. That one of the coping was what was it? Mindful isolation. Yes, because that is true. You can remove yourself, and also you can remove your voice, right? And that's what I thought about. You don't have to respond to everything. You don't always have to bless with your voice, especially if you feel triggered. You can just also take care of yourself by just being silent. And that's a huge deal. You can just focus on your breathing, right? So you don't have to generate or activate energy around that if you're starting to feel like something is triggering you or activating you in some way. You can always just be silent.
I appreciate it too that you gave some some tips for the white people that really want to stand as co-conspirators here and figure out ways to move racial justice forward. I know for me that's been an ongoing awareness and education and conversation, and it takes a vulnerability, but as a white person I have the privilege of only having to touch that vulnerability when I feel like it, and so I really, recommend that if it's new to a listener, that you really go ahead and make some contact with that vulnerability, read some books, maybe come to the counseling center and talk with a therapist to see if you can make some contact with some of this. If it's the first time you're hearing it and you're wondering, like, am I doing microaggressions? You probably are.
and most people who encounter them know that they're happening. Like, they're clear about it. So absolutely, there's a space for you to go to if it lasts, right? If it's something that you feel that you're struggling to kind of process through and get past, certainly please come to visit. Come and talk to us about that. Don't sit and try to override how you really feel. Because I think what tends to happen, I think Shaciarra, you did mention this, you did touch on this, is that there's a tendency to kind of disregard or minimize what's happening. And that is what ends up having this, given this kind of chronic anxiety around it, when it does happen. Because by the time, we do see folk, it's like really, it's high acuity and often chronicity because people have tried to override those feelings for so long.
I love being able to give this a name, racial battle fatigue. I just love being able to put words around it. It can't sum up an individual person's experience, but I think it helps to conceptualize a really chronic and severe problem for a lot of people.
Absolutely. There's no monolith of any BIPOC and QT person, but the collective trauma definitely can be pinpointed. So yeah, you're right.
It's wonderful. So I want to share my screen and remind everyone about how to find us at the Counseling Center. Just a reminder that we are located on the Uptown campus in the Diebold complex, better known as the parking garage, on the first floor, and the entrance is right across from the Riley Center, so that's where you can find our Uptown folks. The clinic hours are Monday through Thursday, 9 to 7, and on Fridays, 9 to 5. Really easy to make contact with the Counseling Center. All you do is call our main number, 504-314-2277. You get to speak to one of our patient representatives, Ms. Charlesetta or Ms. Belinda, who you see there on your screen. And they will do everything they can to set you up with an appointment that same day. So you'll get to speak with one of our clinicians in a consultation appointment. It's an opportunity to just talk a little bit about what's going on. That clinician will make some recommendations. And if therapy is something they're recommending, they're going to talk with you about your preferences for the therapist that you might see at our clinic. And we have a really diverse staff. And when you talk about preferences, you really are able to mention things like race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, and any kind of specialty. And if we have somebody who fits that bill, we're going to try our best to pair you with that clinician. So it's an opportunity to be really honest about, you know, the type of person you think you could connect with in therapy. Most of our sessions that we're doing now are via Zoom, so we can, we'll start there and then we can talk more about that in that consultation appointment. Don't forget that we have groups, many groups, and you can also come in for the consultation appointment, and that's a place to inquire about the groups that we run. I think all of us on this screen run a group or two. Yeah?
I know.
And that is all we need to know.
Yeah, thank you again, Shaciarra, for coming today and sharing all of this wonderful information with us. And I'd like for anyone listening to know that it doesn't, you know, there's a lot of stigma that happens to around in different types of help seeking. And we're just, you can just add us to the way that you seek help for what's going on. And you don't have to be in dire straits to come to the counseling center, right? Although if you feel like you're overwhelmed and distressed, please do come in. But you don't have to be that way. You can come and just check it out. Just check it out and see how you like it. Maybe you might want to just talk about some things and just process to see if that is really something that you may even need therapy around. And so we're here. We can educate you about what to expect from therapy, what therapy really is. We can dispel some of those myths and maybe perceptions you may have about therapy. So, you know, just, you know, stop in, you know, drop in and check us out if you feel that this may be something you need, or if you're curious about it.
It's a really good point, Jinaki. You know, I think sometimes, you know, especially when you first leave home and go to college, you know, you get new information and you start to kind of look at yourself and go, wait, I had these ideas or beliefs or the way I was functioning in the world, and not everybody is doing things that way. Maybe I want to check that out, and therapy can be a really great place to come and explore that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you again. I can't thank you enough. Thank you. Thank
y'all for having me and listening to me rant about things I'm passionate about.
Yes, excellent presentation. I think it's well needed too. And so I hope students really enjoy it.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. We'll be back every Wednesday, so make sure to follow TU Campus Health on our YouTube channel and on Instagram for more episodes of Wellbeing Wednesdays. And with that, we will say goodbye. Be well.
Bye-bye.